The young girl walked slowly onto the big, shining stage. The lights above were bright and warm, almost too bright for her eyes. Her white dress fluttered lightly with each nervous step. She looked so small in front of the huge grand piano. The audience watched in silence, waiting for her to begin. Some smiled politely, but others whispered among themselves, wondering who she was and why such a young girl had been allowed to play at such an important concert. In the first few rows, the rich and powerful people of the city sat in their expensive suits and dresses. They had come to listen to famous musicians, not a little girl. One man, a well-known millionaire who helped sponsor the event, leaned back in his seat with a smug smile. He looked at the girl and then at the conductor beside him. "This should be interesting," he muttered under his breath, his tone full of mockery. The conductor gave a weak smile, unsure of what to say. Deep down, even he wondered if the girl was ready. The audience's quiet whispers grew louder. "Who is she?" one woman asked her husband. "I heard she's from the community program downtown," he replied. "They help kids learn music." "She doesn't look like she belongs here," another voice said from the back. The girl heard every word. Her heart thumped harder. She sat on the piano bench, trying to steady her breathing. Her fingers hovered above the keys, but they trembled slightly. She wanted to disappear for a moment, to escape all the judging eyes watching her. She looked at the piano, the same kind she had dreamed of playing for years, and tried to remember her mother's words. "Play from your heart, not for their approval." The millionaire leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on her. His expression was not kind. To him, this was entertainment, not the music, but the idea of seeing someone fail. He believed talent belonged only to those with money, training, and prestige. A poor girl from a small neighborhood could not possibly play like a professional. He was already waiting to shake his head in disappointment when she made her first mistake. The hall was completely silent now. The girl took one last deep breath, but inside her mind the noise was deafening. Every cruel whisper, every doubt, every memory of being told she wasn't good enough. She remembered the teacher who had once said, "You have potential, but this world doesn't always listen to children like you." She had practiced for months, often on a broken piano with missing keys to reach this moment. Yet here she was, feeling smaller than ever. A bead of sweat rolled down her temple. She glanced toward the crowd again. Their faces were unreadable, some curious, some bored, and a few already looking at their phones. The lights were so bright she could barely see past the first row, but she could feel the weight of every stare pressing down on her. The millionaire crossed his legs and looked at his watch as if to say, "Let's get this over with." The conductor gave her a nod to begin. For a few seconds she couldn't move. Her fingers felt heavy, frozen above the black and white keys. The whispers in her head grew louder. "What if I mess up? What if they laugh? What if they're right about me?" Her chest tightened. Then she looked down at her hands, the same hands that had played through tears, through hunger, through fear of failing. She had promised herself she wouldn't give up now. A faint smile appeared on her lips, not because she wasn't scared, but because she realized something important. They didn't know her story. They didn't know how hard she had worked, how many nights she had stayed awake practicing with headphones on so she wouldn't wake her mother. They only saw a little girl in a white dress, but she knew that music was her voice, and tonight she would let it speak louder than their doubts. She closed her eyes and whispered softly to herself, "Just play." Her fingers slowly touched the keys, testing the cool surface. The piano felt familiar, like an old friend. The audience waited, restless. The millionaire sighed loudly, tapping his fingers against his armrest. He was already convinced the girl would stumble. But the girl no longer cared. She took another deep breath, and in that quiet moment, the entire hall seemed to fade away. The people, the whispers, even the man in the front row. In her mind, she was back home sitting at her small piano, her mother humming softly nearby. That image gave her strength. She straightened her back and pressed the first key gently, letting the sound echo through the hall. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it was pure. For the first time that night, the audience stopped whispering. Even the millionaire's mocking smile slowly faded as he leaned forward again, unsure of what he was feeling. The girl continued to sit there, still not fully playing yet, but preparing herself. The silence that followed her single note was powerful, like a pause before a storm. Every heart in the room seemed to wait for what would come next. She knew this was the moment that would define her. Either they would remember her as the girl who froze on stage, or the one who proved them all wrong. Her hands hovered once more above the keys. She took one final breath, blocking out every thought, every fear, every cruel voice that had ever tried to break her. The millionaire's eyes narrowed. The girl's eyes opened, and just as the audience leaned forward in anticipation, she began to play. In that instant, the whispers of doubt turned into the silence of awe. The moment her fingers touched the first keys, a gentle melody flowed into the air. It was soft, almost like a whisper, but it carried a strange power, something honest, something real. The sound spread through the hall like ripples on calm water, slowly quieting the last few murmurs among the audience. People leaned forward slightly, curious now, unsure what to expect. The young girl's face was focused, her eyes half closed, as if she was speaking through the piano rather than playing it. At first, her hands moved carefully. Each note seemed to test the space, to ask, will they listen? But with every passing second, her confidence began to bloom. The trembling in her fingers faded, replaced by steady grace. The melody grew stronger, filling every corner of the grand hall. The bright blue lights above reflected off the polished piano, casting soft glimmers that danced across her dress. The audience, once doubtful, began to fall silent in awe. The girl's music was not showy or loud, it was full of emotion. It told a story that words could never capture. A story of struggle, of nights filled with quiet practice, of believing when no one else did. People who had come expecting to be entertained suddenly felt something deeper stirring inside them. But one man was still not convinced, the millionaire in the front row. His arms were crossed, his chin slightly raised. He had expected mistakes, expected the girl to falter, and yet she hadn't. The longer she played, the harder it became for him to keep his proud expression. There was something about the music, a strange mixture of sadness and strength, that touched a place he didn't like to acknowledge. He shifted in his seat, frowning. Around him, others were beginning to smile, to nod quietly in appreciation. Even the conductor, who had been tense moments earlier, now watched the girl with wide eyes. But the millionaire refused to be impressed. She's just lucky, he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. Anyone can play a few soft notes, yet deep down something was happening. The music was changing the room and him with it. The girl's performance grew more confident, more alive. Her hands seemed to move faster than thought, each note flowing perfectly into the next. The melody climbed higher, glowing with emotion. The audience was now completely still. No one whispered anymore. No one checked their phones. All eyes were on her, and still she played. Her music began to tell its own story. The quiet notes spoke of her childhood, of broken piano keys and late-night dreams. The louder chords carried the sound of her heart when people said she'd never make it. There was pain in her performance, yes, but there was also victory, the kind of victory that doesn't need applause to be real. Even the millionaire could not escape it. He tried to look away, but his eyes kept returning to the stage. There was something hauntingly beautiful about the way the girl moved, as if she wasn't playing the piano but becoming part of it. The rhythm, the emotion, the focus. It was as though every struggle she'd ever faced had transformed into sound. He began to remember things he had long forgotten. The time he had been laughed at when he was young. The hunger he had once felt before his fortune. The people who had helped him when no one else believed in him. Her music unlocked memories buried deep under years of pride and wealth. And for the first time that evening, he felt small. The girl's melody changed again, now lighter, faster, dancing like sunlight through trees. Her fingers glided across the keys, her posture straight and proud. The hall was glowing with her energy. The music reached places beyond the walls, beyond the people listening. It was as if she was reaching out to every person who had ever felt unseen, every dreamer who had been told they weren't enough. By the time she reached the final section of her piece, something magical had happened. The audience had stopped being an audience. They weren't just watching her play, they were feeling with her. Every note carried them further into her story. The whispers of doubt that had filled the room before were gone, replaced by a quiet sense of respect and wonder. Replaced by a quiet sense of respect and wonder. The millionaire swallowed hard. His face softened. He realized now that he had been wrong, deeply wrong. This was not some charity performance. This was pure art, born from courage and truth. He had mocked her before she played a single note, thinking her small. But now he saw that she was greater than anyone else in the hall. Her music didn't need words or status. It demanded silence, attention, and heart. The final notes drifted into the air, long, graceful, shimmering like silver light. Then silence. The girl's hands rested gently on the piano as she exhaled. She didn't bow right away. She just sat there, eyes closed, letting the last echoes fade into the room. No one moved, not even the millionaire. The air felt thick, heavy with emotion. And then, a single clap. It came from the very back of the hall. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the sound grew until the entire hall was filled with thunderous applause. People stood up cheering, wiping tears from their eyes. The millionaire hesitated. His throat tightened as he rose slowly to his feet. For once, his applause wasn't out of politeness or image, but it came from somewhere deeper. As he looked at the young girl bowing shyly on stage, he felt something shift inside him. He had come to the concert expecting to be entertained, to judge, to mock. Instead, he had been humbled by a child with nothing but a piano and a dream. Her music had silenced not just the audience, but his own arrogance. And as he clapped, he whispered to himself, not in ridicule this time, but in quiet respect. She didn't just play the piano. She played my soul. The sound of her music filled every corner of the grand hall like sunlight pouring into a dark room. The girl's small hands moved across the piano keys with new courage, and every note seemed to carry a piece of her heart. The once skeptical crowd now sat in quiet amazement, unable to look away. Even the chandeliers above seemed to shimmer with her rhythm, reflecting soft blue light across the walls. She played not just with skill, but with something deeper, emotion that came from years of struggle and hope. Each sound had meaning. Each pause carried a story. The audience could feel it. Though they didn't know exactly why, they could sense the truth in her music. The girl was no longer afraid. The whispers of doubt that had haunted her only moments ago were gone. In their place was focus, pride, and something close to joy. She could feel the music running through her veins. It was as if she and the piano were one. The weight of every judgmental stare melted away. The millionaire in the front row still watched her, but now his face was different, less amused, more intrigued. He had expected her to crumble under pressure. He had expected wrong notes, shaky fingers, a humbling failure. Instead, what he saw was strength. Her music had life, emotion, and a kind of honesty he hadn't heard in years. Still, he tried to fight the feeling rising inside him, that strange mix of admiration and guilt. The girl's melody changed again, soft in one moment, powerful in the next. The audience could sense her story in every sound. It was as if the piano itself was telling them about the nights she practiced alone, the broken keys she learned to love, and the pain of being told she didn't belong. Somewhere in the middle of her piece, her mind drifted back to those nights. She remembered sitting in her small apartment, the hum of the city outside, the quiet voice of her mother saying, "One day, they'll listen." She had played then with tears on her cheeks, dreaming of a moment like this, a stage, a piano that wasn't falling apart, and an audience that finally heard her. Now that dream was real, and yet she wasn't thinking of proving them wrong anymore. She was thinking of proving herself right. Her fingers moved faster, stronger. The sound grew richer, almost like a storm building power. The rhythm echoed through the hall, filling everyone's chest with emotion. People in the audience leaned forward, their eyes wide. The conductor, who had earlier looked nervous, now stood completely still, watching with awe. The millionaire's smirk had vanished entirely. He sat with his hand on his chin, studying her carefully. There was something haunting in the way she played, so much emotion coming from someone so young. For the first time, he realized that her music wasn't just performance. It was truth. He thought of his own childhood, of when he had once wanted to become a musician before money became his obsession. Somewhere along the way, he had lost that innocent fire. Watching this girl, he felt it flicker again. But his pride wouldn't let him show it. The audience's faces reflected 1,000 emotions: admiration, surprise, even guilt. They had judged her before she started, but now they couldn't take their eyes off her. Some blinked back tears as her music grew more emotional. Her small shoulders moved gently with each phrase. Her head tilted as if she was listening to something only she could hear. The grand piano gleamed under the lights, its black surface reflecting her hands like a mirror. The stage itself seemed to come alive with her presence. She played not for applause, not for approval, but because music was her language, her way of existing in a world that often refused to see her. And the world, at least for this one moment, was listening. The millionaire shifted again in his seat. He wanted to look away, but he couldn't. He could feel something heavy in his chest, not anger, but realization. He had mocked her without reason, laughed at her before she'd even begun. And now her music was quietly dismantling every prejudice he had built in his heart. As she continued to play, the hall seemed to hold its breath. The melody rose higher, more intense, carrying the audience to a place beyond words. Then for a fleeting second she looked up, not at anyone but at the ceiling, as if searching for something. The light caught her face, and it was clear. This was not fear anymore. It was victory. The last part of her song approached. Her hands moved gracefully, the notes melting into one another like water flowing over stone. The millionaire felt a lump in his throat but didn't understand why. The room was completely still except for her music, and then the final chord. It rang out pure and powerful, echoing through the hall before fading into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The world felt frozen. The millionaire sat still, eyes fixed on the girl who had just rewritten his understanding of talent, courage, and dignity. Then the applause began, soft at first, then louder, building like thunder. The girl blinked, almost surprised, as the audience rose to their feet. The same people who had doubted her now cheered her name. She smiled, a small, humble smile, and bowed her head. She didn't need their praise to know what she had achieved. She had turned every whisper of doubt into music, and somewhere in the front row the millionaire clapped too, not out of habit but out of something deeper. For the first time in years he felt inspired. The girl he had ridiculed moments ago had reminded him of something he had long forgotten. That true greatness doesn't come from wealth or status, but from the courage to play your truth, even when no one believes in you. The music began to rise like a wave, gaining strength, sweeping over the entire hall. The young girl's hands no longer trembled. They flew across the piano keys with confidence and emotion that surprised even her. Each note was stronger than the one before, and her melody grew louder, more alive, like a voice shouting to be heard after years of silence. The sound wrapped around everyone present, demanding their attention. The audience was completely still now. Not a single whisper, not a cough. All eyes were fixed on her. The bright stage lights reflected in the millionaire's eyes, but for once he didn't notice. He sat up straighter, his hands clasped in front of him, watching the girl with growing disbelief. What had started as quiet curiosity had turned into awe. The child he had mocked was no longer just a little girl playing piano. She was an artist commanding the room. Her music changed again, deeper, fuller, heavier with emotion. It was no longer the soft tune of a beginner, but the storm of someone who had lived, struggled, and survived. The rhythm carried her pain, her memories, her courage. The hall seemed to breathe with her as her music poured out like rain. In that moment, she wasn't thinking of the audience or the millionaire. She wasn't thinking about being judged or doubted. She was remembering. Every note she played came from a memory. The nights she practiced until her fingers ached. The times people laughed when she said she wanted to perform. The long evenings when her mother worked late, leaving her alone with her piano and her dreams. Those moments had built her, shaped her, and now they were flowing out of her through the keys. The millionaire shifted again, his smugness long gone. He couldn't deny it anymore. She was extraordinary. He had seen many performers in his life, but none who played like this. Her music wasn't just sound, it was truth. It had fire and beauty and something no amount of money could ever buy. Heart. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his eyes following every movement of her hands. He could see the emotion in her face and the quiet intensity, the small smile that came when she hit a perfect note. For the first time, he wondered who she really was. Where had she learned to play like this? What had given her such soul? The orchestra behind her began to join softly, following her lead. The violins swelled in harmony with her playing, and the entire stage came alive. It was as if the instruments themselves had been waiting for her to set them free. The audience could feel it. Something magical was happening. The girl pressed harder into the keys, her back straight, her expression glowing with emotion. The hall filled with sound so powerful it felt like the walls were vibrating. The millionaire's chest tightened. He felt something he hadn't felt in years: humility. The kind that comes when you realize how small you are in front of real greatness. He remembered the cruel smile he had given when she first walked onto the stage. He remembered whispering to the conductor, expecting a disaster. Now he felt ashamed. Every note she played reminded him of how wrong he had been. He looked down for a moment, unable to face his own thoughts, but the girl didn't know and didn't care. She played on, lost in the rhythm. Her music grew bolder, like a storm reaching its peak. The sound rolled through the air, shaking the hall with emotion. People began to tear up. Some covered their mouths. Others simply sat, motionless, afraid to even blink in case they missed a single second of it. Her small figure on the large stage looked almost unreal. The piano keys flashed under her fingers, white and black blending into a blur of movement. Every muscle in her arms moved with purpose. The conductor stood perfectly still, letting her lead, knowing she didn't need guidance anymore. Then something shifted in the room, a quiet kind of energy, the kind that happens when everyone feels connected to one single moment. It was as if time had stopped. Her music rose higher, shining like light through darkness. The audience felt it in their hearts, the pain, the strength, the beauty. The millionaire's eyes softened. He saw not just a performer but a story, a girl who had fought her way to this stage despite everything. He thought of his own daughter, who had once dreamed of being a musician before he pushed her toward business instead. For the first time he felt regret, and then came the most powerful part of the piece. The girl's hands crashed down in perfect harmony, producing a sound so pure, so full of life that everyone in the hall seemed to hold their breath. It was a cry, a roar, a song of freedom. The lights above glowed brighter, and for a moment it felt like the world itself was listening. When the music softened again, the girl's expression changed. Calm now, peaceful. The storm had passed. Her hands moved slower, the melody tender like a mother's lullaby. It was forgiveness, and one for those who doubted her, for those who mocked her, and maybe even for herself. The millionaire's eyes filled with tears, though he tried to blink them away. He had come to the concert for entertainment, but what he got was a lesson, a mirror held up to his pride. Her music had spoken to the deepest part of him, the part he had buried under money and ego. The song neared its end. The girl's final notes floated gently through the air like feathers. The last sound lingered, echoing softly in the silence that followed. No one moved. The audience, the conductor, even the millionaire, all frozen in that perfect moment of awe. The little girl, breathing hard, looked up at the crowd. For the first time she smiled, not out of pride but relief. She had done it. She had turned every insult, every doubt, into music so powerful that it silenced them all. And in the front row, the millionaire finally understood. The true measure of greatness isn't wealth or status. It's the ability to move hearts. And that night the girl had moved his. As the final notes of her song faded into the golden glow of the hall, the young girl sat quietly, her hands still resting on the piano. Her heart raced, her chest rising and falling with the rhythm of her heavy breaths. The world around her seemed to disappear. The stage, the audience, even the grand chandelier above. All she could hear was the echo of her own music inside her mind. But that silence, and that beautiful silence, and didn't last long. In that quiet space, her thoughts drifted back like a movie playing behind her eyes. She remembered where it all began. She had been just 5 years old the first time she touched a piano. It wasn't a shiny black grand like the one before her now. It was old, scratched, and missing a few keys. Her mother had bought it second-hand from a church that was closing down. "It's not much," her mother had said with a tired smile, "but it's yours." The little girl had fallen in love instantly. Every night after school, she'd run home, wash her hands, and sit in front of that piano for hours. The sound was uneven, sometimes harsh, but to her it was magic. She didn't have a teacher at first. She learned by watching videos on her mother's old phone and listening to songs again and again until her fingers could find the right notes. There were nights when her mother worked late, cleaning offices, and the apartment was quiet except for the sound of her playing. The girl would imagine herself on a big stage like this one, wearing a beautiful white dress with people listening, really listening. She'd close her eyes and dream of an audience that didn't care about her skin color, her background, or how poor they were. All that mattered in that dream was the music. But the world outside that dream was cruel. At school, when she told her classmates she wanted to be a pianist, some laughed. "That's not for people like us," one boy said. Others just rolled their eyes. Even some adults gave her that same doubtful look, the one that said, "How sweet," but impossible. She heard it so many times that it started to echo in her mind. Still, she practiced, even when her fingers hurt, even when her mother said they might not afford new piano strings, even when the power went out and she had to practice in the dark, remembering the sound of each key instead of seeing it. Then one day, a music teacher from the community center heard her play. He couldn't believe his ears. "Where did you learn this?" he asked. When she told him she'd never had lessons, his eyes widened. "You have something special," he said. "Don't ever stop." That teacher became her mentor, helping her practice for hours after school. He taught her not just to play the notes, but to feel them. "Anyone can press a key," he said, "but only a true artist can make the piano speak." And she did. Her talent began to shine, and soon she was invited to perform at small local events. But every time she stepped on stage, there were always a few eyes that looked at her with doubt, the same eyes that had whispered when she first entered this grand concert hall tonight. She could hear those whispers now, in her memory. "She doesn't belong here. She's just a charity act. Let's see how long she lasts." Each time they said it, she worked harder. Each insult became a spark. Each doubt became a reason to keep going, and tonight on this big stage, she had poured all those years of pain, practice, and perseverance into her music. Her hands, still resting on the piano, trembled as the memories faded. The hall was still silent. For a brief moment she wondered if they hadn't liked it, if she had failed. But then she looked up. She saw faces frozen in awe. The audience wasn't just quiet. They were moved. Some had tears in their eyes. Others were still holding their breath. She realized then she had done more than just play music. She had told her story without speaking a single word, and then her eyes found the millionaire in the front row. He sat completely still, staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Gone was the smirk he'd worn earlier. His eyes looked softer, as though something inside him had changed. He looked like a man who had just remembered something important, something he had long forgotten. For a second, their eyes met. The girl didn't smile, didn't bow. She just looked at him, calm and unshaken. It wasn't pride that filled her heart. It was peace. In that look, the millionaire saw everything. The pain she'd endured, the strength it took to get here, and the message hidden in her music. It wasn't about proving him wrong. It was about showing the world what true beauty looked like, the kind that grows in silence, watered by struggle and hope. He blinked hard, realizing his mistake. He had judged her before she played a single note. He had believed talent was owned by those with money, with fame, with connections. But here she was, a girl who had started with nothing, whose music had just silenced an entire hall of critics. The girl looked back down at the piano, her reflection shining faintly on its black surface. In that reflection, she saw both who she had been, the scared child who practiced in the dark, and who she had become, the artist who could move hearts with sound. The applause began to rise behind her, but for a few moments she didn't hear it. She was lost in thought, reliving every step that had brought her here. Every time she'd wanted to quit, every tear, every small victory, she whispered to herself so softly that no one could hear, "Mama." They finally listened, and then finally she smiled. What the audience saw was a girl who had just performed beautifully, but what really happened that night was far greater. A dream that had once lived in a small apartment on a broken piano had finally come true. And the millionaire, once blind with pride, was among the first to rise and clap, his heart heavy with both shame and admiration. Her music had done what words never could. It had told the truth. The final note lingered in the air like a whisper that refused to fade. For several long seconds there was nothing, no clapping, no movement, not even a cough. It was as if the entire hall had forgotten how to breathe. The girl's fingers were still resting gently on the keys, her head bowed slightly, her chest rising and falling in rhythm with her racing heart. Her racing heart. She didn't dare look up at first. She thought maybe she had made a mistake. Maybe the audience was silent because they didn't like it. Maybe she had disappointed them. The thought made her stomach twist. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed them in her lap. But then something strange happened. The silence began to change, not in sound but in feeling. It wasn't cold or empty anymore. It was heavy, warm, full of emotion. She could feel it pressing around her like invisible air. That kind of silence didn't come from disappointment. It came from awe. In the front row, the millionaire sat motionless. His eyes were fixed on the stage, his jaw slightly clenched. For once, his mind wasn't calculating or judging. He wasn't thinking about money or power or appearances. He was just feeling. He tried to fight it at first to keep his usual mask of superiority, but the music still echoed in his head, refusing to let go. Every note she had played seemed to carry a piece of truth he had spent his whole life avoiding. He remembered when he had been young, before the money, before the arrogance. He remembered what it was like to have a dream, a real one, not built on wealth but on passion. And suddenly, his throat tightened. The man who had once ridiculed her now sat frozen, humbled, almost ashamed. He could hear his own cruel laughter replaying in his memory, and it made him sick. He had come here expecting to witness failure, but what he had witnessed instead was greatness, pure, undeniable greatness born from pain and perseverance. The girl slowly lifted her head. Her big brown eyes scanned the room. At first, all she saw were still faces, expressions unreadable. Her heart skipped a beat. Maybe they hadn't liked it after all. But then she saw it, a tear. A woman in the front row wiped her eyes quietly. Then another person sniffled. Then another, and suddenly the hall erupted. Applause exploded like thunder. The sound echoed through the vast space, bouncing off the golden walls and velvet curtains. People stood up, and one after another, until the entire audience was on their feet. It was a standing ovation that seemed to go on forever. The girl's eyes widened. She blinked rapidly, unsure how to react. The sound of hundreds of people clapping for her, and felt unreal. Her hands covered her mouth as her body trembled. She had dreamed of this moment for so long that now it felt like a dream come true right in front of her eyes. The millionaire was still sitting, not because he didn't want to clap, but because he couldn't move. He stared at the stage, overwhelmed by something he couldn't explain. His chest ached with emotion. He had never cried in public, but his eyes burned now, fighting back tears. Finally, he stood. Slowly, deliberately. The girl noticed him rise, the same man who had laughed when she walked onto the stage. For a moment, time seemed to stop again. Their eyes met across the hall, two completely different worlds colliding in silence. And then, he began to clap. It wasn't polite applause, the kind given out of social duty. It was slow, sincere, full of respect. The people around him noticed and followed, clapping even louder. The sound grew so powerful that the girl could feel it in her chest. She stood and bowed deeply, her white dress shimmering under the lights. The applause only grew louder. She smiled shyly, tears glistening in her eyes. For once, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel out of place. She felt seen. She felt heard. Back in the front row, the millionaire whispered to himself, "Incredible." He turned to the man beside him, who was also clapping furiously, and said softly, "I was wrong about her." But even as he said it, he knew the truth went deeper than that. He hadn't just been wrong about her. He had been wrong about life. He had spent years thinking talent came with privilege, that art belonged to those who could afford it. But tonight, a little girl with nothing but heart and hope had proved him wrong. She had shown him that true art comes from the soul, not from status. As the applause continued, the girl looked around the hall, her smile growing. Somewhere near the back, she spotted her mother, standing with both hands over her heart, tears streaming down her face. The sight made the girl's own tears fall freely. She wanted to run to her, to tell her that all the years of sacrifice had been worth it. But for now, she just smiled through her tears and bowed again, dedicating the moment to the woman who had believed in her when no one else did. The millionaire's applause slowed as he wiped the corner of his eyes discreetly. He took a deep breath and whispered something under his breath, words only he could hear. "She reminded me what I lost." The ovation went on for several minutes before it finally began to fade. The conductor approached the girl and whispered, "You did it." She nodded, unable to speak, her throat too tight with emotion. As the audience began to settle, the millionaire turned toward the stage again. He wanted to meet her, not as a patron or critic, but as a man who had just been changed by her music. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel superior. He felt grateful. The girl took one last look at the grand piano, her reflection glowing softly on its surface. She reached out and touched one of the keys gently as if thanking it. Then she turned toward the audience, bowed one final time, and smiled. That smile, innocent, proud, and full of peace, stayed with everyone in the hall long after she left the stage. And somewhere deep inside, the millionaire knew that he would never forget it. That silence, that song, that little girl, they had changed him forever. The applause finally began to fade, but the echo of her music still hung in the air like a dream no one wanted to wake from. People were smiling through tears, whispering to one another about what they had just witnessed. The young girl stood beside the piano, her heart still beating fast, her mind spinning between disbelief and joy. She had done it. She had played from her soul, and they had listened. The millionaire was still standing, though his applause had quieted. For a long moment he didn't move. His face, once cold and proud, looked strangely human now. His eyes were slightly red, not from anger, but from something softer, something he hadn't felt in years. He took a deep breath, almost as if trying to steady his heart before it spilled over. Slowly, he began to walk toward the stage. The crowd noticed. The whispers started again, this time not cruel but curious. Everyone knew who he was, the man who funded the event, the man who had laughed when the girl first appeared. Now he was walking toward her with something that looked very much like humility. The girl saw him coming. For a moment, fear flashed through her. Old instincts from years of rejection, but it vanished as quickly as it came. She stood straight, hands clasped politely in front of her, her white dress glowing softly under the lights. The applause died down completely, leaving only the sound of the millionaire's footsteps echoing across the wooden floor. When he reached her, he stopped just a few feet away. The audience held its breath. The man looked up at her, a small girl standing tall before a crowd that had doubted her. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. He swallowed, his throat tight. Then, in a voice quieter and rougher than anyone expected, he said, "You reminded me what real beauty sounds like." The girl blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. He continued, his voice trembling just a little. "When you walked on stage, I saw only what you looked like. I didn't see who you were." He paused, lowering his head slightly. "But your music showed me everything I needed to know." The hall was silent again. You could hear the faint hum of the stage lights above. The girl didn't know what to say, but she didn't have to. Her small smile was answer enough. The millionaire nodded, his eyes shining. "You didn't just play notes tonight," he said softly. "You told a story, and it changed mine." A few people in the audience clapped again, softly at first, then louder as the emotion spread. The millionaire turned to face them and, with a rare sincerity, began to clap once more. Not for himself, but for her. The crowd followed, and the applause swelled until it filled the hall like thunder again. The girl bowed deeply, her hands pressed together. Her eyes sparkled with tears, but this time, they were tears of happiness. When the applause faded once more, the millionaire leaned closer and said quietly, so only she could hear, "You have a gift, something money can't buy. Never let anyone make you doubt it again." She looked at him, truly looked at him, not as a powerful man, but as another soul who had just been touched by music. "Thank you," she said softly. For the first time in his life, the millionaire didn't have a clever reply. He simply nodded and stepped back, allowing her to have the moment she had earned. As he returned to his seat, he couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. He remembered how he'd mocked her, how certain he had been that she would fail. The memory burned like shame, but instead of avoiding it, he let it stay. Because for once, that pain felt like a lesson. He thought of his younger self, the dreamer he used to be before life became all about money and status. He remembered the sound of his mother's voice telling him to follow his heart. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped listening. But tonight, this girl, this little pianist from nowhere, had made him listen again. The girl, meanwhile, stepped off the stage, her mother rushing to meet her in the wings. "You did it!" her mother cried, wrapping her in a tight hug. "You did it, baby! You did it, baby!" The girl laughed and cried at the same time, her body trembling from the emotions of it all. "Mama," she whispered, "they stood up for me." "They really did." Her mother kissed her forehead. "I told you, one day they'd listen." Out in the hall, the millionaire remained seated long after everyone else had left. The stage was empty now, but he could still hear her music echoing in his mind. For the first time in years, he felt small. Not in a bad way, but in a way that reminded him what it meant to be human. He pulled out his handkerchief, wiped his eyes quietly, and smiled to himself. Maybe, he whispered. It's time to start listening again. And as he stood to leave, he made a silent promise that he would use his wealth not to impress, but to inspire. That he would help others like her, the ones with dreams too bright to be ignored. That night, everyone left the hall changed. Some were inspired, some humbled, but none were the same. The millionaire walked out under the cold night sky, his heart lighter than it had been in years. Somewhere in the distance, he could still hear the echo of her piano, and for the first time in a very long time, he smiled. Not the smile of a man who owned everything, but the smile of a man who had finally found something real. The concert hall had emptied out slowly, but the feeling in the air still remained. Heavy, powerful, unforgettable. The young girl, exhausted yet glowing, stood beside her mother backstage. Her hands still tingled from the keys, her ears still ringing from the endless applause. She could hardly believe what had just happened. For so long she had dreamed of playing on a grand stage like this, and now that she had, it didn't feel like a dream anymore. It felt real. Her mother wiped a tear from her own cheek and whispered, "You see, the world finally heard you." The girl smiled softly. She was too tired to speak, but in her heart, she knew her mother was right. A few minutes later, there was a knock on the backstage door. The stage manager peeked in. "Someone wants to meet you," he said with a small smile. "He says it's important." The girl looked up puzzled and then saw him and the millionaire. He stepped carefully into the room, no longer wearing the proud grin he'd had earlier. Now his eyes looked gentle, even nervous. He held his hat in his hands like a schoolboy about to apologize. Her mother stood protectively beside her daughter, unsure of his intentions. The man took a deep breath before speaking. "Miss," he began, his voice soft and sincere, "I owe you an apology." The girl blinked, unsure how to respond. The man continued, "When you walked onto that stage, I judged you. I doubted you. I thought you didn't belong there." His eyes lowered, his words heavy with regret. "But you proved me wrong. You didn't just play music tonight. You changed something inside me." The girl's mother folded her arms, still cautious. "And what is it you want to say now, sir?" she asked firmly. He looked at her, his expression honest. "I just wanted to thank her," he said simply. "Her performance reminded me of something I lost a long time ago. Humility." There was silence for a moment. Then he reached into his coat pocket and took out a small golden card, his business card. "I sponsor a scholarship for young musicians," he explained. "It covers training, instruments, and travel for gifted children who can't afford it. I would be honored if your daughter would accept it." The girl's mother's eyes widened, but she didn't answer right away. She turned to her daughter. "Do you want this?" she asked quietly. The girl thought for a moment, then looked up at the millionaire. Her voice was small but firm. "I don't want anything for free," she said. "If I earn it, then I'll accept it." The man smiled, humbled again by her honesty. "Then earn it," he said gently. "And when you do, I'll be waiting to help you go as far as your heart can take you." He placed the card on the piano and turned to leave. But before he reached the door, the girl said, "Sir?" He turned around. "Yes?" She smiled, a bright, genuine smile. "Thank you for listening." The man paused, his chest tightening. He nodded, his voice soft. "No," he said quietly. "Thank you for making me listen." As he walked out, he glanced back one last time. The image of the little girl standing beside the piano, her white dress glowing under the soft light, would stay with him forever. Outside the theater, the cool night air hit him. For once, he didn't think about his business, his money, or his reputation. He just thought about the music, that haunting, beautiful melody that had silenced his pride. He stood under the streetlight, watching people leave the concert hall, still talking about the girl. A small smile formed on his face, not of pride, but of peace. He felt something he hadn't felt in years. Hope. Back inside, the girl sat at the piano one last time before leaving. She pressed a single key, letting the sound echo through the empty hall. Her mother came up behind her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did it, baby," she whispered. "You really did," the girl nodded, her eyes shining. "It wasn't just me, Mama," she said softly. It was every time we didn't give up. Her mother smiled, fighting back tears. "Let's go home," she said. As they stepped out into the quiet night, the moonlight spilled across the street, wrapping them both in a soft silver glow. The girl looked up at the stars, her mind still replaying the moment the hall had gone silent. The silence that had once been her greatest fear, now her greatest victory. Somewhere far behind them, the millionaire stood watching from a distance. He didn't approach again. He didn't need to. For the first time in his life, he was content to simply admire greatness without trying to own it. That night, he made a promise to himself to fund more programs for young, unheard musicians, those whose talent had been buried under society's judgment. He would make sure the world never again ignored a voice like hers. And as he walked away into the night, he whispered under his breath, "She silenced me." And in that silence, I finally heard. The young girl's music lived on, not just in the echoes of the concert hall, but in the hearts of everyone who had witnessed it. It became a story told again and again, the night a millionaire ridiculed a girl, only to be humbled by the power of her song. And though many years would pass, one truth remained. Real greatness needs no wealth, no fame, no power. It only needs courage, a heart full of faith, and the strength to keep playing, even when the world doubts you. Even when the world doubts you.